a lot of new players and old players alike struggle with creating their backstory, and I've made videos in the past about backstory mistakes, but the reason why people's backstories don't work or don't exist is really because of something different. It's not because their backstories are too long, too complicated, too in-depth. It's because they don't know where to start in the first place. Well, I think that that's a really real issue that I haven't really addressed on this channel as of yet. So I need to fix that. And today I'm going to be going over some building blocks that you can use to create your backstory and to flesh out your character in Dungeons & Dragons, or really whatever role-playing game you choose to play. Without further ado, let's get started. Okay, the first reason that your backstory doesn't exist or doesn't work is because you didn't talk to the DM. This is so important. Now, I know a lot of people already do this, and if you do, skip this part because you already know it. But if you don't talk to your DM about your backstory, you're really missing a trick. Look, most DMs are perfectly willing to help you flesh out your character. It's helpful for the DM as well, because if they want to rope the character into the plot, knowing who they are and understanding them from the get-go is really important. On a personal note, I have one-on-one session zeros with each of my players to do the normal session zero stuff, but also to usually create characters. During that character creation process, they throw some ideas at me for their backstory and ideas for their character concept, and I work with them to make it work. And I think that that's a main reason why the characters in our campaign have worked so well, because we work together to create them. I understand the characters from the get-go, so I know how to integrate them in their campaign, and they neatly integrated their character into the world because they work with myself, the DM, the person who's running the world. If you don't know where to start, your DM can throw you some ideas. If you're confused on a lore bit, or you don't know how you can integrate your character into the campaign, your DM is probably more than likely happy to help you. And I think that that's really important. So many players think that they're on their own when creating their backstory. It's their character, they gotta do it on their own. But creating a character isn't homework. You can absolutely get some help, and your DM is hopefully willing to help you out. And I think that that's really important, both for the DM and the player. I think that that is definitely step number one, and possibly the most important step if you're stuck on creating your backstory. Alright, tip number 2. The player's handbook, right up there, that is really helpful. There's a lot of good stuff in the player's handbook, a lot of good stuff in those rolling tables that they have for the backgrounds. If you're completely stuck, if you've got writer's block and you have no idea what flaws to give your character, what bonds to give your character, stuff like that, there are whole rolling tables in the player's guide that help you to do that. Now, not all of those flaws and bonds are perfect. Some of them, in my opinion, are too specific or not very helpful at all. I don't see a lot of them working in a D&D campaign. A lot of them not working for the characters that I make. But, I mean, really, they can help you to create your own ideas. And a lot of the time, my players will look at those flaws, bonds, ideals, etc., and use them to create their characters, or at least get an idea. One of my new players, Kyla, she played a blood hunter named Daphne, whose whole personality was based on a couple of rolling tables. Now, she didn't roll randomly. I wouldn't recommend randomly rolling your character's personality, just in case you get something that's really confusing. But you don't need to randomly roll on rolling tables. There's no rule that's forcing you to do it. Just picking and choosing things that you like, that's perfectly fine. And my player, Kyla, absolutely did that, and she made a killer character out of it. She didn't know where to start, so she started with a couple of traits from a rolling table and built out the character during the campaign. Now, we'll talk about that later, but besides rolling tables, looking at background, class, race, those are also good ways to build out your character and just to plant the first seed. Talk to your DM about what the race's culture is like in the campaign setting, and if they don't know, consult the player's guide. It can give you some good ideas. Each race has extensive paragraphs about their history and culture and such, so read that and see if you can determine what you want your character to be from that. I mean, everything that I read, consume, listen to even, can give me ideas for a character. That's a lot of where my NPC ideas come from. So the player's guide, literally meant for players creating characters, I mean, it can absolutely give you ideas. I know for a lot of people, this will also be a really obvious point, but it's, for a lot of people, something that they easily skip over. They see the player's guide as something to mechanically make a character, but for a backstory, for creating the story behind your character, it is absolutely invaluable. I totally recommend it. Or any supplementary materials that help you to create a player. You don't want to miss out on the resources within official D&D material. Tip number 3. Don't be afraid to take inspiration. This is a huge one for me. I've seen so many players be afraid that they're not being original enough, and frankly, I don't think that that's a big deal. Look, I don't think you should carbon copy a character from a movie or a television show just because I think you're doing yourself a disservice. I love writing characters in D&D, and I think a lot of people would love writing characters if they got into it. Creating your own character, someone that belongs to you, that's one of the best parts of this game. I think you're missing a trick if you just carbon copy a character from somewhere else. But frankly, even if I took a character from media, say Anakin Skywalker, take his personality and minor elements of his backstory, and transform it into Dungeons & Dragons, that's already practically a new character that's no longer Anakin Skywalker. As long as I'm not, like, quoting him or using his name or something, then that's a different person. Sure, I've taken elements of his backstory, but, I mean, yeah, it's no longer a carbon copy of Anakin Skywalker by principle of the fact that he's in Dungeons & Dragons. Now, I don't think you should do that per se. Like, I don't want to just be playing D&D Anakin Skywalker, but that's a decent starting point. From there, I can tweak parts of his backstory and make it into my own. That's how I made a lot of my favorite NPCs. Kalia Sulfero, the DMPC character I talked about in my How You Can Make an NPC Companion Work video. You can check it out if I remember to put in the cards. I won't remember. It's on my channel somewhere. In that video, Kalia Sulfero, the titular character that my party loves so much, I mean, she was originally just Arya Stark transposed into D&D, and then I changed around her backstory a lot over time. That is how I created her. There's nothing wrong with taking inspiration from something that you love, and it can really get people hyped to play Dungeons & Dragons. I mean, in my game, my player Caden, he based Flint off of all his favorite pirate movies. I mean, that's where he started. He just wanted to be a pirate, and that made him super excited and enthusiastic to play Flint Strider, his own pirate captain that originally started as somebody based on his favorite pirate movies. You don't need to be 100% original, and even if you try, you probably would never succeed in being 100% original. Everything is based on something. There's nothing wrong with that. If you're enthusiastic about some piece of media and you want to emulate that in Dungeons and Dragons, if you want to take inspiration, go ahead and do it. Talk to your DM about it. See how you can make it work in your game. Number 4. Tip number 4, do not be afraid to let your character evolve over the course of the campaign. Seriously, this is one thing that I think a lot of players forget about. You don't need to finish your backstory. A lot of players never create a backstory because they're afraid that they're not going to get everything they need down into the backstory. But you don't need to do that. This is Dungeons and Dragons. You're not putting this onto television for millions of fans to watch and criticize. It's a D&D game. If your backstory isn't 100% fleshed out and finished, that's okay. You can continue to work on it as the campaign progresses. Now, I do recommend having something before starting. Now, don't use this as an excuse to, again, never finish your backstory. But I think a lot of players get caught up in trying to finish and completely flesh out the story before they even start. And I think that that's just not a good use of time. You don't need to do that. You don't need to have a backstory 100% done. It's a big reason why a backstory never gets finished or it just doesn't work to begin with, because there's too much in there or because the player is too focused on getting it done before the game even starts. It doesn't need to be done. A lot of my NPCs evolve over the course of the campaign because, frankly, later on down the line, I usually come up with better ideas than what I had previously. My BBEG has changed so many times in my Descent into the Veil campaign that I cover in Campaign Diary. I mean, seriously, like 5 or 6 times. Multiple times I have changed the nicknames of characters, their titles, etc. because I usually come up with something cooler. My players don't mind that. They understand that I am evolving the story. I'm human. I don't come up with perfect ideas on the get-go. Now, of course, I do set limits for myself. I need to, because otherwise our campaign would be ever shifting and super confusing. I need to set limits for myself when writing. Now, I do recommend doing that for yourself as well, but honestly, talk to your party about any changes you want to make. Talk to your DM. They're probably going to be okay with it. If you're not enjoying a character because you aren't happy with some old piece of backstory that you wrote months ago, don't be afraid to change it. I mean, seriously, you're playing this character. Make them yours. It's okay to evolve them over the course of the campaign and come up with new ideas as you play. Naturally, while playing Dungeons & Dragons, new ideas will pop up in your head. Whether they're better ideas or whatever, it doesn't really matter. You're going to come up with something while playing, something new, and that's great. That's part of playing the game. Let your character evolve naturally. Just because you've already written your backstory doesn't mean it's set in stone. You can add new additions to it. Like, for example, if your character rolled a natural 20 on carpenter's tools, maybe they were a carpenter's apprentice in the past. I mean, as long as it doesn't super conflict with something and horribly ruin the campaign, which I can't imagine it would, that's a cool addition to make to your character. So yeah, let your character evolve. It's one of the best things you can do in Dungeons & Dragons. Okay, finally, tip number 5. We've reached that point. You don't need to be a master writer. This is kind of the same as what we talked about previously with you don't need to finish the backstory, but you also don't need to make it some amazing piece of literature. So many people I talk to are afraid that their backstory isn't good enough for their D&D group, but I mean, seriously, you're just playing a game with your friends. Your story doesn't need to be good enough. As long as it's not like horribly offensive or something, your fellow players will probably be okay with it. Again, open communication is important, but yeah, if you're doubting your backstory, talk to your fellow players about it and see if you can get some guidance on how you can improve it. And if they think it's good, then yeah, it's good. And frankly, it probably is. You don't need to be a master writer while playing Dungeons & Dragons. You just need to get some ideas down. This game's about having fun, not making the best written story. It's not an English essay. The joy I get from creating a character isn't from the paragraphs I write about them in my bullet journal thing that I keep for all of my D&D campaigns. The joy that I usually get from writing my characters is just the ideas that pop into my head. And yeah, journaling them down and writing long paragraphs about their backstory, that can help with that, but that's not the main point. The main point is the ideas that pop up for the characters. You don't need to write literature for your D&D characters, and it doesn't need to be good. You don't need to worry about that. As long as you, your DM, your party, as long as you guys think that your character is good, that's all that matters. It's the only audience that you have and the only audience that's seeing your character. They belong to you. So yeah, write them the way you and your party find fun. Woof, that was a lot of information. Do you know how many takes I had to do on this? I messed up so many times. Oh my god, I need a script. But anyway, look, point is, writing a backstory can be so fun and so helpful when playing Dungeons & Dragons. It's a big part of why I love this game. So I hope that you took away some good stuff from this video. In summary, use your resources, whether it be your DM, rolling tables, inspiration, and don't be afraid if your backstory isn't finished or isn't good. You're just writing it for your table. I hope this video helped you guys to start out with your first D&D backstory or to improve the backstories that you make for future characters. If you enjoyed it, then please do leave a like on this episode of Tabletop Tavern Tips. If you want to see more of my content, we do RPG horror stories, as well as I have a campaign diary podcast where I go in depth on my own D&D campaign, the lessons I learn. Then please do subscribe to Crispy's Tavern if you want to see more of that content. And finally, if you want to leave your own tips or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment backstory to let me know you made it to the end of the video. And that's just like, comment, subscribe. I will see you all next time. Farewell.